All right. Wow. I'm super excited to be talking to you, man. I'd be remiss if I didn't inform. I promised one of my friends that I would shout him out when talking to you, but my friend Falstaff from the Ghost Jail podcast is a huge fan of your work. I believe he introduced me to your work in the first place, but since then I've been a huge fan of your work, especially your YouTube videos. But I've read your books. Your books on the Wittgenstein family, especially, is really great. Your biography of God, I also very much enjoyed.
Well, thank you very much. Some of those were written some time ago, and I occasionally pick them up and look at them with utter disgust, and other times look at them and think this is really great stuff. So it's very difficult to criticize one's own works, but it's very nice to hear that they're still being read and enjoyed. Thank you.
Yeah. So what this podcast is it's kind of like a book club, but right now we're pretty interested in the Rosicrucians and like the Elizabethan time period. We're reading, I don't know do you know of John Crowley?
Yes. Not well, but I actually started discovering about it through you because I could see you were obsessing about it. So I thought it might be quite interesting.
Yeah, we're reading his Egypt tetralogy, and I think you'd very much enjoy it, just knowing your own interests. And he's one of like the finer American authors we have left, so I like to promote us good Yanks when I can. But yeah, so we were kind of covering a little bit of the Oxfordian theory. I dare even call it a theory at this point. With your latest video on George Virtue and David's YouTube documentary on this particular line of evidence, I found to be like some of the most like over like almost heavy-handed in how obviously it makes the case for the Oxfordian authorship theory. But I know that you obviously agree, but we could do like a little primer for people who might not know.
Yes. Do you mean a primer about the work I've been doing, the primer about the Oxfordian case, a primer about any other aspect of it? I mean, I presume that all your listeners will be aware of what the Oxfordian case is, indeed what the so-called Shakespeare authorship question is. And that question is essentially, was William Shakespeare a pseudonym? Or was it the name of a man called William Shakespeare who lived at Stratford upon Avon? Now, where I've got to in this great journey is a long way past that question. There is absolutely zero doubt in me whatsoever that William Shakespeare of Stratford wrote nothing. His parents signed their names with crosses, or one of them did. His daughter signed her name with crosses. He was supposedly the greatest writer in the history of the world. It's simply not. To me, I've got past the point of even thinking it's worth discussing, but I totally understand that some of your listeners may be thinking, what are you talking about? They may even be thinking this is the first I've ever heard that William Shakespeare was a pseudonym. But this has been going on for literally hundreds of years. And the area of speciality that I've looked into is to examine very, very closely what people at the time that William Shakespeare was alive said about William Shakespeare. And we have this most extraordinary situation whereby the professors of English literature around the world who cleave to this idea that he was William of Stratford, who had no literary records or anything like that, they say, well, what anybody said about Shakespeare at the time in his own life was very cryptic, and we can't really understand it, and then they move on. And I said to myself, well, yes, it is cryptic, but what does cryptic mean? It means secret, it means hidden. So clearly, if everybody's writing about William Shakespeare in such a way that is secret and hidden, that is cryptic, it means that there must have been something about William Shakespeare that was prohibited from overt expression by his contemporaries. And so I started looking very, very closely at everything that was written about him from the end of the Elizabethan age into the Jacobean age and even beyond. The one you're talking about, the recent presentation I put up, dates from 1741. And it's fascinating to realize that the secret fact that William Shakespeare was the pseudonym of Edward de Vere, the 17th Earl of Oxford, remained a secret right through till 1741 at least. And certainly at the time, everyone who was talking cryptically about Shakespeare, once you look at those cryptic references carefully and forensically, you can see that they are all saying the same thing, that they're all privy to the same secret, that William Shakespeare was the pseudonym of Edward de Vere, Earl of Oxford. So that's where most of the focus of my work on Shakespeare has been, on the contemporary allusions to William Shakespeare.
Yeah, I think the most interesting work you and your the De Vere Society, correct, have been doing is following like that transmission, like the almost like apostolic transmission of this sort of secret, or the covering up of this secret down the line, because I do believe that there is like this kind of unbroken, or potentially broken at some point in the mid 18th century, I would gather, succession of people who were privy to this understanding, and were also like making monuments and things with the extremely cryptic ones, like ones that are kind of purposefully displaying this understanding, but at the same time not like concealing it, if that makes sense. I mean, that's what is cryptic, or, you know, something, it just means like with an intent to deceive at least a part of the audience, which seems to me to be the case. And that line of succession going through the early days of like Masonry, especially, is what's been interesting me recently, considering that, like, you know, we have the connections to Alexander Pope, et cetera, and that sort of Masonic height of England in the 18th century, when, especially in the year 1740, as we've gone over many times, with the 1740 having a particular importance to Edward de Vere himself as a number.
Yes, well, this is the most extraordinary thing about the discoveries that I've been making, is that you quite rightly said just then about keeping a secret, or the way you put it, if I remember correctly, you said the intent to deceive at least some of the population, and that is a key point. It was actually, in my view, not so much an attempt to deceive, that the deception was a byproduct of it. It was actually an intent to preserve the truth in a very high-minded way, that the truth mattered. And if you have a truth that is subject to censorship, then what do you do about it if you wish to preserve it for future ages? Well, you encode it, or you put it slightly cryptically, so that only what they would call the truly worthy will understand. And I think that truly worthy, in the case of Shakespeare, turns into a smaller and smaller and smaller group. So when we're talking about the 1740s, we're talking about possibly no more than 3, 4, 5 people who are part of a Masonic group, and it's unquestionably being passed through the Masons. And I think I've actually succeeded in proving that pretty well by following the symbolism that has been used right through from the time when the Sonnets dedication was published and right through to 1740. We're seeing very, very consistently the use of 3 triangles, the use of this idea of a quaternary that is concealed within a ternary. This is something that John Dee mentions in his Monus Hieroglyphica in 1564. And he says, "Oh, God," he says, "forgive me for saying something about this in print, this great mystery, but only the truly worthy will understand." So I noticed when I first read that sentence that there was something deeply profound and important about what he was saying, the way he brushed it off and didn't explain it. And I managed to follow that up, and I'm seeing countless examples of it. Now, if people are listening to this and they don't quite understand what I'm talking about, it is visually represented in Royal Arch, the Royal Arch Freemason symbolism. For instance, in the famous Triple Tau, we call it the Triple Tau because it looks like a symbol of 3 T's. It's known as the key to the treasures. If you contemplate it and look at it for a while, you'll see it actually has 4 T's. There's actually an upside down T in the very center of it. Equally, were I to put together 3 equilateral triangles so that there are 2 on the bottom, if you like, and 1 on the top, you'll find that you inadvertently create an upside down triangle in the center of it. That is what Dee is talking about in symbolic terms when he talks about the quaternary that is concealed within the ternary. And in broader terms, in more divine terms, it was carrying, I believe, a secret that is a very simple secret, if you like, that man is himself divine, and that the church may stamp its foot and say, no, 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 the fact of the matter is that God is a tripartite, what we call it a Trinity, consisting of Father, Son, and Holy Ghost, But these people were saying, yes, but man is part of that trinity. He is the concealed quaternary within the ternary. He is that part. And that's one of the reasons why all this had to be kept very secret. Now, I'm mentioning this because it is through this very thing, this quaternary that is concealed within the ternary, that I used as a key to unlock so many mysteries about Shakespeare authorship, and it works every single time. Now, you mentioned 1740, and that links to what we're talking about. This was an odd thing that I was looking at references to Shakespeare and even some of the Shakespeare writings and the sonnets, and time again I'm coming across this 1740, and it manifests itself in all sorts of different ways. So a very simple way, for instance, is at the very end of Hamlet, when Hamlet dies, in the first folio it says, "The rest is silence, stop," and then dies. Now, no actor worth his salt acts because it just doesn't come across. I think John Rylance did it once, but it's such a feeble line to say 4 times and then die that one wonders why it's there. And the rest is silence dot is 17 characters, and is obviously 40, so that's 40. So 1740 dies. Now this is telling us that Hamlet is actually based on Edward de Vere, the Earl of Oxford. Now, why do we know that Edward de Vere, the Earl of Oxford, was 1740? And this goes back again to John Dee. John Dee writes in a book that he wrote the foreword to about Euclid, and he writes, he urges clever people to sit and to meditate the number of their own name so that they can align it with the Trinity. And again, so we're back to this idea of the quaternary that is hidden within the ternary. And Edward de Vere comes up with the number 1740. And if we're looking at the Royal Arch symbolism, for instance, what I was talking about, the triple tau, and we start moving into the complicated world of gematria, where A is 1, B is 2, C is 3, and into a world where the intellectuals and the worthy, if you like, are thinking of the universe created by God using letters and numbers. These are the very, very first parts of creation, and that letters are numbers. They're not different, they're the same. A is 1, B is 2. D is very, very insistent that you use only the Latin, the ancient Greek, or the Hebrew alphabets to do this. So we get this number 1740, and we know that Edward de Vere, who's Shakespeare, is the 17th Earl of Oxford. 4T can also pun with 4 T's. And T in Latin alphabet gematria is 19, 4 19s are 76, and the word Oxford, if you count all the letters there, is also 76. But it's cleverer than that, because we're talking about the quaternary that is hidden within the ternary. So if you have 3 T's, that's the normal ternary, the normal trinity, if you like. T is 19, so 3 T's are 57. 17 plus 40 is 57. So he's aligning himself to the Trinity, and that hidden part with his name in it, 17 Oxford, which is represented by the pun 4T, i.e. not 4O, but 4 T's, the letter T. I hope, without visual representation, I've made some sense there, and I haven't lost all of your listeners. But I think that the whole of this thing is very, very visual, and that's why I've been using YouTube and video to explain it all, because once you see it illustrated in front of you, it all opens up and becomes very simple.
Yeah, I agree entirely. I mean, I bully all of my listeners to watch all of your videos all the time. So this will, of course, everyone should go and binge watch your entire series of, et cetera, new, and the various other ones. I think De Vere, the one that you did, like Angel, like, what is it? Where it shows like the dichotomy of his character is probably my favorite out of all of them.
Oh yes, Edward de Vere, Saint or Sinner. That one.
Saint or Sinner. That's right. Yes. That's right. Yeah.
Well, I'll tell you, the thing that really, really excited me about the whole thing was discovering where Edward de Vere was buried, and I worked it out in such a way that I knew that it involved overlaying the front cover of the sonnets onto a map of the South Cross Isle, which is what we now know as Poets' Corner in Westminster Abbey. And you would have to see the video to understand exactly how I did it. But just to take you through the emotional aspect of that is I realised that once I'd drawn the right shape on the front cover and I was going to overlay this onto the South Cross aisle at Westminster Abbey, that particular place, which was, by the way, was marked by the fourth T, 4T again, we're onto that, I knew that particular place, once it was overlaid, would land precisely on the spot in the South Cross aisle at Westminster Abbey where Edward de Vere was buried. And I was very excited about that, and I thought to myself, well, I'll do the overlaying, and as soon as I see where that dot lands, I'm going to get in the car, and I'm going to go straight to Westminster Abbey, and I'm going to go to that spot, and if I'm very, very lucky, there might be a little cross in the stone or some mark or some signal that I'm right, that I've definitely got it right. So I overlaid this thing onto the map, and where did it land? It landed precisely upon the Shakespeare memorial statue that was placed there in 1740. There we go back to this number again. And I can tell you that sent a real chill right across me and a real sense of excitement. And so I went to the Shakespeare monument and looked at it carefully and saw that he was pointing at a scroll with 17 letters across the top of it and 4 T's down, 1740. So I really, really knew that I was really onto something here. And what I've found now is such a phenomenal amount, including people who are all Freemasons during the 17th century, who were all saying things like Shakespeare is buried in Westminster Abbey. And these references have been known about, but scholars have said, you know, they got that wrong, haven't they? Of course, we all know he's buried in Stratford upon Avon. Well, they're wrong, and these Masons are correct. He is buried in Westminster Abbey. His name was Edward de Vere, and he is right on the spot where they placed that magnificent statue of William Shakespeare in 1740. It's the most extraordinary find.
It's extremely extraordinary because I would think that this it seems so much more in the character of the works, right? Like themselves. Like this seems, once you fully imbibe this worldview and like the worldview of the Elizabethans at the time, and you're reading like Cardano and, you know, you're reading John Dee, it seems almost impossible that this other theory, this kind of mythological figure and like sort of theme parkization of the Stratford upon Avon area. Another video of yours I'd highly recommend, of course, is you absolutely devastating the Shakespeare Authorship Trust. I loved watching that one. But it's astounding to me how this mythos came to dominate in the first place. But I think it must be something to do. It has to be in like the 18th century with the real renaissance of Shakespeare. Like when Shakespeare is like coming back into public consciousness in a major way, and he's being sort of taken as an icon of like British patriotism. Even I feel like there was a strange collision of forces between like under Walpole, where you had like the more old right Tories and the patriot Whigs on the same side, and they were both like kind of allied under like the banner of Shakespeare. But I feel like they understood this very differently, right? So like that is potentially why I think that the sort of truth hidden in the deception. So you have like the Shakespeare the statue, right, as you discussed at Westminster Abbey, and it's not showing Edward de Vere. It's showing the sort of fictitious Shakespeare based off of like the first folio portrait and whatnot.
Yes, it is showing that, but it is also a deeply symbolic Freemasonic monument. So once you stare at it for a bit, you notice all sorts of things about it. And one of the things, since we're talking about 1740, it actually has 1740 represented on it 3 times and one quaternary hidden, a 4th time that's sort of hidden. You would have to look at it from behind to notice that. It is also has a little bit of Latin written on it, written by Alexander Pope, who we know was a Freemason. The thing was designed by William Kent, the architect, who was also a Freemason, and very much sponsored by Lord Burlington, who was also a Freemason. Everything comes in 3s in this weird language. And the what's written on the monument can be read in a number of ways. And one of the ways of reading it is to say that this monument was put up using the name Shakespeare to commemorate someone buried underneath it. That's one way of sort of translating the Latin that's there. So again, what you're talking about is the birth of Stratfordianism. Now, Stratfordianism, for those of your listeners who aren't sure, is the belief that William Shakespeare was this illiterate genius merchant from the British Midlands, from Stratford upon Avon. That's what I say when I say Stratfordianism. Yeah. And for your listeners, can I just say, just for your listeners, if they catch me saying Shakespeare, it means I'm referring to the Stratford man. It's just a convenient way within the authorship discussion of not muddling ourselves up, because otherwise people say, of course Shakespeare wrote Shakespeare, and we're in a silly muddle. So if I say Shakespeare, I'm talking about the guy from Warwickshire, from Stratford upon Avon. If I say Shakespeare, I'm talking about the author, and obviously I don't believe they're the same person.
You don't have to go through all of the introductory stuff. I like to bully my readers. I think if any of them are still Stratfordians today, they're not very big fans of mine, but
okay, that's great.
People who are just like pestering me. But what I was saying, I remembered. What I was saying was, I think that the Stratfordian myth, though, isn't just about the specific authorship. I think it has a lot to do with our conceptions of authorship itself, and where genius, or say aesthetic or creative inspiration, comes from. Because the Stratford figure is more than just a specific character in time, because obviously we don't have much about this nonsensical character, which is why all the biographies of this character tend to be more revealing of the author who's writing the biography than of the character of the works themselves, the Shakespearean works. But I think it's like, I always call like the Stratfordian mythos like the mythos of like journalism. Like like it sort of presents Shakespeare as this journalist. He's from a parochial or like more rural area. He moves to the city, and through his own like wit and his striving upwards, and his just like innate character, his innate superiority, he meritocratically climbs his way to the height of the canon. And I think this is like a very, very silly sort of myth, but I think it's like part of why it was so important is because of the like rising middle classes, and that attach themselves to this as like being like that their own rise in the socioeconomic hierarchies is like the true English story, and that English story is the story of Shakespeare.
Well, I mean, you're right to a large extent, but the myth is also deleterious. And the great problem with it is that the middle classes who you say supported that, and you may be right about it, or at least thought it was okay as a story, this myth, actually rolled up their sleeves and got working and got themselves educated and advanced themselves, and that's how they became who they were. The story of Shakespeare of Stratford being this great genius without any apparent education or learning, or, as I say, rolling up his sleeves and doing any work, is deleterious. You're actually teaching children in schools that if you don't have the natural genius of William Shakespeare of Stratford, then forget trying to be a great writer like Shakespeare, because it's not going to happen. Whereas when you understand who Shakespeare is, you can see exactly how his phenomenal education happened, and how he got very, very excited as a scholar, going through Cambridge University, through the Inns of Court, and then surrounding himself with lawyers and scholars and poets, and going out abroad into Italy and places to discover more about the education and the means of education and the learning that was going on in places like Padua and Strasbourg. And suddenly it all makes sense. And you cannot be a very great genius, I'm sorry, well, certainly not a genius of that nature, if you have no education. And so, as I say, I think it's a very bad lesson that we are teaching our children if we're telling them that Shakespeare was a sort of Dick Whittington figure who just rose from nowhere, did all these amazing things, and that nobody at the time commented upon it or thought it was remotely odd.
Yeah, I also think that it's bad for that reason. That but what's ironic, I think, is that we Oxfordians are the greatest argument, right? The Stratfordians have is that we're snobs, and I have no problem with being a snob personally. I think being a snob is good.
Nothing wrong with being a snob at all. It's a huge compliment. And if you look at the history of culture going back forever, it is about snobbery, if you like. That
cultivation, sophistication,
cultivations, and
civilization. Saying like, no, I won't do that. I won't eat that. I won't. That's this is good.
And also the competition. I mean, the whole cradle in which Shakespeare was born was one in which the English were a little bit chippy. They felt they were behind culturally, behind the Italians and behind the French, certainly. And time again, you see this expression saying, well, we can beat them. We can beat the French. We can beat... I'm talking about literature. I'm not talking about in arms. I'm talking about literature. We can beat them as poets. We can beat them. And also the Greeks and the Latin, the Romans. We can be the best at this. And that is, in its sense, a form of prejudice, a form of chippiness, if you like. But out of that rose this absolute greatness. I think we're living in an age now where everything has to be entirely flat. Everything has to be fair, in fact, so fair that if someone doesn't appear to be a William Shakespeare, then the William Shakespeares of this world must be muzzled to allow the people who don't have that sort of inspiration or drive to shine through as the true William Shakespeares of our age. And that's why I think culture is in a pretty rotten place at the moment.
Yeah, I think we could tie this to the Stratfordian mythos, though, because what I find to be the major like hermeneutic for literature, at least for the curation of a promotion for new literary ventures, is mostly this sort of like you're selling the biography of the author. Like I often call the genre like autoethnography, especially in America, right? If you have a unique like immigrant background or something, the notion is that not like irregardless of your education or your sophistication or like your engagement with the tradition of literature, that by your perspective, like this perspective, which we can designate sociologically as being, one of these like rising classes or from the aesthetic hinterlands or something, that this unique perspective is what genius actually is. It has nothing to do with anything besides the sort of innate character of your identity.
Yes, and I think that genius is also, well, it's this driven desire to interpret the world through a certain lens, through your own personal lens. One of the problems when you're accused of being a snob for being an Oxfordian is actually the folly of the accuser, who hasn't got the imagination to think that just because someone is an earl, just because they're born into what you might consider certain privilege, it means they have no understanding of suffering, no understanding of humour, no understanding of the common man. They simply can't do that. And so you find people, I mean, literally bridling. You can see their bodies bridling when you tell them that William Shakespeare was the Earl of Oxford. And that to me is what snobbery is. Snobbery is, if you like, the obsession, an unnecessary, redundant obsession with class. So to come from the other end and say, oh, you just say Shakespeare is the Earl of Oxford because you're a snob, I'd say is a very snobbish remark in itself.
Yeah, I agree. I don't know if I would call it snobbish, but I would call it like it's definitely bigoted in some sense.
Well, it's class conscious is the point, and as you mentioned, I'm a chairman of the De Vere Society in England, and I know all of the leading Oxfordians around the world. I know many, many, many Oxfordians. I've never ever come across a single one of them who has ever said that Shakespeare cannot have been William of Stratford on class grounds. It's simply never been said. I mean, it is perfectly possible that a grain merchant from the British Midlands could have written the works of Shakespeare, but not that grain merchant from the British Midlands. We know enough about him to know he certainly did not write any of the Shakespearean works. And it's not to do with his class, it's to do with who he was and what we know about him. And again, I would say that Edward de Vere, well, he was in a fascinating position because he was in and out of the court. He was repudiated by the court. He was a favourite of the court. I mean, all sorts of things were going on there, and you can feel that in every one of the Shakespeare plays. What I think one of the most astonishing things about the Oxford case, and this is where I picked it up. So when I got into this game, the most evidence about the Oxford case was saying, well, all of the plays seem to be autobiographical. He seems to be confessing his life through his works. And you get that time and time again. I mean, for instance, if you take King Lear, that's about a man who gives his 3 daughters his inheritance and then it gets in a temper about it. Well, this happened to Oxford, who gave his ancient castle to his 3 daughters, and that all went wrong. If you look at Othello, there's a man who is in Venice when he's told that his wife has wronged him, and then he mistreats his wife only to repent. This is exactly what happened to Edward de Vere when he was in Venice. And, well, for instance, if you look at Timon of Athens, it's about a very, very generous patron who gives away all his money and nobody likes him after he's given it away, and they suck up to him mercilessly when he's got it. Again, identical to the life of Edward de Vere. And you can go on and on and on doing this. So he does seem to be confessing his life through his works, just as Ovid did. Ovid was the favourite poet of Shakespeare, as we know. So the whole of the Oxfordian case, when I came to it, well, not the whole, but a lot of it was about this. It was about these extraordinary parallels between the life and the plays. And to me, it was missing one part, and that was, as I said, it was a contemporary linking Oxford to Shakespeare. I felt if you've got that, then it's game over for the Stratfordians and for everyone else. And I found it in this work called Polymantia, in which the word sweet Shakespeare is set as a margent note alongside a line which says court dear verse, all hyphenated. And I'm not brilliant at these sort of crosswords and puzzles, but I saw straight away that contained our de Vere in the correct letter order and word order. And I took the other little letters out of it and saw that they were an anagram of a secret. So court dear verse actually contains our de Vere, a secret, set right underneath the word Oxford and right beside the margent note sweet Shakespeare. So that triangulation, something we were talking about earlier, that completely told me that I could no longer sit around saying, well, Oxford's the best case, but he's not completely signed and sealed. That, for me, was the first step in what has now become a colossal mountain of contemporary evidence that totally proves the case.
Yeah, I think the other thing, like for like just academically, why this should just be taken for granted, I think at this point, and we can just expand from there, is how much more text it adds to the Shakespearean canon. Because if we look, then we can there's so many things that are harder to explain under the Stratfordian lens. Like for instance, like the earlier versions of Hamlet and the Howe plays and these sorts of things. But it becomes very obvious that if you look at the final Shakespeare works as just like the final revisions of plays that have been being performed and worked on for many years, it all makes much more sense. And then you can add all of this in. You could add in De Vere's poetry, which we have examples of, and I've seen people say are like stylometrically or stylistically not similar to Shakespeare or something, which I don't buy in any way. I don't know what stylometrics they're using.
No, they don't say it's not similar to Shakespeare because they can't. And funnily enough, before 1920, when the first book was published saying the Earl of Oxford was Shakespeare, before that, the great expert Sidney Lee, a great Shakespearean expert, didn't know that Oxford was probably Shakespeare, and he wrote a thing saying that Oxford's verses and Shakespeare's verses are in kindred key. So you have to be very careful with the bias that goes on. And of course, since 1920, when everybody's been saying, well, a lot of people have been saying the Earl of Oxford is Shakespeare, we suddenly find a revision of opinion, and people are saying, oh well, those verses by Oxford are rubbish. He couldn't possibly have been Shakespeare. They're rubbish. Well, I looked at them and I thought they're absolutely beautiful. We don't have very many of them. There are 20 or so verses. All of them we know written when he was a teenager or less. So isn't it exciting now? We've got the juvenilia of Shakespeare. Now, there was a man called Benezet, Professor Louis Benezet, who took lines, no fewer than 4 at a time, from Oxford and from Shakespeare, and mixed them all together, and it's known as the Benezet test. And you can read that poem, which is about 80 lines long. So as I say, it's mixed lines from Oxford and mixed from Shakespeare. Unless you cheat and look them all up, or you know your Shakespeare incredibly well, it's quite impossible to tell the difference. And you can put it in front of a know-all who says, oh, Oxford's poems aren't very good, and say, okay, well, let's do the Benezet test then. Put it in front of them. You tell me now which are the bad lines of Oxford here and which are the brilliant ones of Shakespeare, and they can never do it, and it's a laugh.
Yeah. What do you think is part of the I just think there's so many institutional reasons for why the theory is left to us, right? Us here on the our independent academics, you might say, to even talk about. Is it just because someone like Stephen Greenblatt, or you have the like big Shakespeare scholars, etc., if they've been duped fundamentally, or they've been unwilling to see all of this, is it just too much of a cost for them to like suddenly give up the game here and start doing some real research? Like what is the real impediment towards this being taken like seriously on a wider scale?
I believe that a lot of these English literature academics do take it seriously, and they are extremely unsettled by it, and that quite a lot of them, to my certain knowledge, who will not publish on this, are agreeing now that the Earl of Oxford was Shakespeare. But you have to remember there are many problems within academia that are problems not just in English literature, but everywhere. For starters, I would say that the English literature departments should jolly well let go of this subject. You know, what is the study of English literature? It's the study of difficult recondite texts, or explaining the meaning in a text. When we're asking who Shakespeare was, this is a historical matter. It's a question for historians, not for English litters. And it's the English litters who have seized this subject and jealously guard it and snap at any historian who dares to go near it. Or what about lawyers, for instance? The lawyer's job, the professional job of a lawyer is to, or attorney as you would call it, is to look at evidence and examine evidence. That's what they do all their lives. And lawyers are to a man Oxfordian. There was a time when the American Supreme Court had a majority of judges on it who had declared for Oxford. So the nuisance here is that the English litters are holding on to it, and the reason they're doing it is because Shakespeare is such a great writer that there's a huge, mark of distinction to be a Shakespearean scholar. And so they want to own it. Now we get, of course, into the whole area of what's known as peer review. If you are a young, ambitious academic in an English literature department and you want to start writing about Shakespeare, you do not start saying that he was Edward de Vere, because you will not be published. Because to get published, you have to show your essay to all of the other Shakespearean scholars who have been doing it for years, and they're not going to let you be published. So we have a really silly situation, really. As I say, we've got the wrong experts, because they're Eng-litters, guarding this thing jealously, prohibiting their own kind from even dipping a little finger into this. And so outside of that, we've got a whole world of you and me and lots of scholarly, intelligent people who are just working the whole thing out and sorting the whole thing out. Well, this little island of people at Stratford upon Avon guarding their fortress are just looking sillier and sillier as this thing goes on. At some point, it will have to break. And I think to be honest with you, I feel we're quite near to that point. I think the death of old Stanley Wells will probably be the turning point. Hello?
Oh, there we go.
I don't know what happened. At some point in my last blathering, we got cut off from one another, so I don't know. You're probably gonna have to edit.
You were saying that because of the like peer review process and these sort of institutional factors disallowing people in English language or English lit departments specifically, that it's sort of been left to historians, lawyers, and people like us.
That's right, and that the so-called experts have become more and more smaller and smaller. I mean, look at the number of Shakespearean experts who are working in universities, professors around the world. How many are there? Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds. Now ask yourself, how many of them are actually publishing on the biography of Shakespeare? I mean, we're down to 6, 7. It's the most extraordinary thing. You've got Shapiro and Stanley Wells, and they're just a little handful. And everybody else, all these other Shakespearean experts in the English literature departments are just stum about the biography, because they know it's hot water, and they know, well, I think a lot of them know that they're wrong, and that they don't want to publish on Stratfordianism because it sounds wrong to them. So they just waffle on and on and on about the texts, and perhaps that's the best thing. They're English literature people. I'm dying for the historians to grab this by the throat within academia and deal with it. But there we have it.
I mean, I would kind of connect it more towards like the destruction of like real hermeneutics, I guess, in like literary faculties in the first place, because the idea that like historians and like literary hermeneutics are somehow like split off or two different things, to me is like almost absurd. Like I can't imagine having I think the historical background or historical context of a work is like a vital, necessary thing to being able to understand its meaning in the first place. So like that, like this sort of new criticism, or the turn towards like the text itself, the text existing like for us outside of its own like historical production, I think it was a big trend in English language, especially criticism in the early 20th century, roughly at the same time as the Oxfordian theories coming out. And I feel like this style of hermeneutics and styles derived from it, for instance, like audience response theory and things like this, that makes up the majority of the hermeneutics that are operating in like literary faculties now. And in that case, like they're already exiling history from their discussions in the first place.
Yes, and it's a great, great shame, because as soon as you realize how personal, how autobiographical the Shakespeare works are, they open up to you and they become doubly, trebly, quadruply layered with excitement. And take, for instance, that wonderful scene in Hamlet, where Hamlet trains the actors to put on a play that will prick the conscience of those in the audience, in the court, Claudius and whatnot, who he perceives to have murdered his father. And now layer that even more. We know that Oxford was training actors. We know that that play, or we can very much guess that that play was performed at court in front of people like Lord Leicester, Lord Burleigh, and that now we have a layer within a layer within a layer, because not only are the characters and the play within the play pricking each other's conscience, but they're also recognizing themselves in the characters that are there on the stage, and Oxford among them, and Leicester as Claudius, etc. So imagine the absolute frisson of excitement of seeing Hamlet in the court of Queen Elizabeth when they're piecing it together and saying, ooh, that's based on me, that person who's acting that. So we miss out on all of that if we're just going to get stuffy at it and say art for art's sake. And I often come across people who are antithetical to the Oxfordian thing, and they say, well, what does it matter who wrote Shakespeare? A number of times I've heard that line. What does it matter who wrote Shakespeare so long as we have the plays? I couldn't be further from that philosophy if I tried. It matters because it's a historical matter, and why not get history right? What's the point of history if we're just going to get it all wrong? And to say we have the plays in that sense of isolation, well, I would retort that you're not understanding the plays properly, because you don't know who wrote them, you don't know the viewpoint, you don't know what he's talking about. And I won't say half, of course, because we can sit, as Stratfordians can sit, and get a great deal of pleasure from seeing the Shakespeare plays. But certainly it adds, let's say, a 10-25% lustre to the whole thing when you understand what's really going on and why he's saying these things.
Certainly. And I think that is part of one of the best cases for the Oxfordian authorship, is that it doesn't cheapen or diminish the works at all. It actually complicates them. It makes them much deeper. It provides untold levels of layers and contexts in which you can further refine your understanding of this. And like the more you get out of it, like the more the text seems to speak about these sorts of issues and the contemporary issues of the time. And like it's really like, I've always liked Shakespeare, and I remember being a little Stratfordian not too long ago, maybe 5 years ago. Yeah. And since like this all just kind of came to me as I got more and more serious about getting interested in Shakespeare and Elizabethan literature in itself, like at the time, reading like Thomas Nash and all these other people. It just opens up so much more of that world. And the ties, like, if we go to John Dee now, or we go to like this sort of Hermetic and like the Masonic traditions that are being at work here, and how these play out in America and in England of that the 17th century, especially the 17th century, it opens up this whole world, and I find it extremely important as an American, because my fascination has always been in like really early, like even pre-revolutionary American history. And there's a lot of ties we can make directly here between these sorts of things. Like we have John Winthrop Jr., John Winthrop's son, who founds the Connecticut colony. He's also bringing over copies of the Monas Hieroglyphica, and he signs his name with Dee's sigil on like early purchases of land in the American colonies. So it's like this sort of stuff. It doesn't exist really like in the pop cultural consciousness, or even in like the historical consciousness, I would say, of my fellow countrymen. but it ties like it really makes history real. It makes it seem living, like when you can make all of these connections, it suddenly has a meaning and it's no longer abstract.
Yes, that's fascinating. I didn't know about the use of the monas there in America. I have to say, though, I'm quite a latecomer to all of this side of it, to the proto-Masonic aspect of it and the D aspect of it, and I'm now absolutely, totally absorbed in it. But I was dragged in, really kicking and screaming. The Baconians did a lot of work on this. They spotted very early on in the late 19th century that Shakespeare appeared to be making a lot of Freemasonic references. And of course, they tied that into Dee, who is very much connected to the sort of Rosicrucian movement. And so that was part of their way of saying that Shakespeare was Bacon. And I always shied away from that. I always felt that, the thing about symbols is anything can essentially symbolize anything if you try to make it do so. And I think the Baconians did go far too often in the wrong direction and got a lot of mockery for it. But when I started seeing these symbols that were absolutely clear as day, having these meanings, then I, bit by bit, moved towards this and realized that Oxford was clearly as embroiled in it as Bacon was, and that in fact you could transfer some of the best arguments about Bacon to Oxford. And the connection with Dee, of course, is completely fascinating. I mean, you only have to look at the dedication to the sonnets published in 1609 and see how it's laid out as 3 upside-down triangles. And you and many of your listeners who have been thinking about these things straight away would say, that's very interesting. Why are these 3 triangles there and how does that connect? And I just ended up getting deeper and deeper and deeper into it and getting very interested myself in the sort of spiritual side of this, in the philosophical side, and feeling a huge sympathy for these people. If you look on the internet, which I'm sure you've done many times, you'll find so much anger and rage and hatred of Freemasonry. And I really do think that Freemasonry has probably gone off in many silly directions, and there probably are a lot of ridiculous and, well, I'm always hesitant to use the word evil, but it does crop up. I think there is an evil element going on in present day Freemasonry that is very, very far removed from what I'm talking about, what we're talking about when we're looking at Bacon and the Rosicrucians and John Dee and William Shakespeare. I sense that it was a very honourable thing that was going on then. The first sniff of cheating appears with the Farmer and the Confessio Fraternitatis, where there's talk. Have you gone again? Oh. But yeah,
it's no problem.
I don't know where we got to there, but I was talking about
the Masonic,
the different
Masonic connection.
Yes, and the difference I felt that exists between the proto-Masons of Shakespeare's day and the slightly seedy Masonic movements or things that are going on in the quasi-veiled name of Masonry today. And that there was an honour there, but you find even right at the beginning, and I know you've read deeply on the Farmer and Confessio Fraternitatis and those things, that there is a wariness of the con man, of the cheat, of the fraud, who's sort of nibbling in at the corners of all this, and probably selling fake philosophies to people early on. But I really need to separate in people's minds what I think John Dee and Shakespeare and Bacon were doing with these sort of proto-Masonic ideas and what the modern Freemasonry is about, because I think it's moved into a very, very different area now.
I mean that's it. So it goes with so many things, right? And also it's like when we talk about the Masons, like which ones are we talking about, right? There's so many different spin-offs of this, or it's the same sort of thing with the Rosicrucians and the Theosophists or the modern Rosicrucian churches. Is that a lot of the point of this mythos or the point of these original organizations is kind of lost as the mythology is taken differently over time, or these institutions evolve and are taken over by different people and emphasizing different aspects of their mythology, or moving it in different directions. But one connection I wanted to make here that I think is very compelling is one of De Vere's earliest poems, right? The laboring man that tills the fertile soil. in line 9, he says, "The mason poor that builds the lordly halls dwells not in them, they are for high degree. His cottage is compact in paper walls, and not with brick or stone as others be," which is a very interesting little bit. When you also tie this to if you look at like the earliest charters of masonry, I think Michael Myers, the mythos, the ritual writing is very Elizabethan.
Yes, there's a very beautiful poem that I think the essence of that poem is about the giving of yourself to others. That's what the sort of overall message is, and it ties in with Cardano's comfort. I think from my read, and I can go on and on reading because I can tell there's a huge amount ahead of me to read. So, I speak as one who feels they're really only scratching the surface. But even so, I think I can put in a simple sentence what this early proto-Masonic movement is all about. And it's essentially the belief that God is in his creation, that he's not separate from his creation, and that to get close to God, one must study and learn. And so if God made the table in front of you or the animal in the field, we have to know about him. This craving for knowledge was a craving to get closer to God, and ultimately, as we get in the chemical wedding or something, to have a unification of man with God, who is part God anyway, who is divine. So that to me is an honourable. Some people may say, well, it's misguided, it's wrong, but it doesn't really matter. It's an honourable driving force that was behind these people like Shakespeare, well, Leonardo da Vinci, Francis Bacon. I mean, there are many of the greatest intellectuals of the age were into this type of philosophy, which stems essentially from Hermes Trismegistus and then through the Neoplatonic movement in Florence, which was so influential at that time. But so I'm reading up on all this stuff and actually loving it and feeling a great personal sympathy, empathy, and excitement with the whole thing. And as I say, I just get a little bit forlorn when I see, even on the comments on my YouTube things, oh, well, if Shakespeare was into this, he was a Satanist, for instance. We're getting a lot of that coming through because there is...
Those are just the Catholics, Alex. Don't worry about them.
Right. Okay. Is it just the Catholics? I don't know.
Most of the Catholics. I'm not gonna lie. Most of like the hardcore anti-Masonic propaganda, especially like in later times in the 20th century and stuff, it's mostly coming from the Catholic Church. A lot of it is a projection. Obviously, the Masons aren't totally pure and innocent either, but you can see the obvious geopolitical aspect of this.
Yeah. Well, what do you have to say about? I hope I'm not going too off topic, but I'd be interested in your response to a lot of the sort of messaging that appears to be going on at the moment. For instance, very famous pop stars, rock singers, whatever they are, having their photograph taken, looking through one eye through a lens with the three fingers up, which people say is a symbol of 666. We're getting a lot of these sort of 666s in modern political rhetoric. Yeah. And now, what in your view is this about? What's happening there?
So I think there is a kind of cargo cultism for the Illuminati, right? Or for like these sorts of secret societies and fraternities. But this is like a more modern phenomenon, in my opinion. I think this is like a very like mid 20th century, especially late 20th century change. Because in the middle of the 20th century, you get this huge explosion of like conspiracy theory literature, which is tying all of this stuff to like, all of these secret societies and stuff. But before that, in the 19th century, and leading up into like World War II, et cetera, everyone was involved with these sorts of fraternities, especially in America. Almost everyone. This is like how you got your health insurance. Was you'd be a woodsman of America or something like that. You could be a Prince Hall Mason, various types of Masons, or a Shriner, an Oddfellow. There's tons and tons and tons of these orders, and this was like what composed society in America for the most part. So we have this kind of alienation from that aspect of our own culture. And it takes, with taking on this sinister overtone now through like the conspiracy theory literature, people are then adopting it as like they're like cargo culting the virtual reality of these secret societies. So it's not that they're like trying to tie themselves to like the historical Masons, but they're tying themselves to like the idea of a secretive, powerful like network of people who control the world. And that I mean that has its own sort of advertising, right? It's sort of like when Jay-Z named his record label Rockefeller. Like he's trying to like summon like, you know, the clout of the name Rockefeller in the same way. There's obviously like also this stuff is really good for getting impressions and on stuff, creating controversy. There's a lot of what is it, public relations firms, like marketing firms, who would kind of insert a lot of these sorts of things because they found that it drove web traffic. It would, because people would do like dense hermeneutics on your music video if you seem to be deploying like Illuminati symbolism and stuff like that. And all it really does at the end of the day, worst case scenario, is you're getting people to believe that you're extremely important and connected to like the most powerful people in the world, et cetera, et cetera. Like it is kind of flattering in a way, right?
Right. And so in your view, they're not necessarily connected to the most powerful people in the world. They're just trying to put that message out.
Yeah, I mean, they are connected to powerful people, right? If we're talking about like pop stars and stuff, but you know, pop stars are pretty low on the chain of actual power in the world. But they definitely like to. But like, you know, I don't know. In America, we love to imagine that our celebrities have this like really important influence. I think it's because we don't have the hereditary aristocracy, so this is our version of that. Except, I mean, we do have a hereditary aristocracy. It's just that we don't talk about those people. Instead, we talk about celebrities. And we think that celebrities are like these all-powerful people.
Yes. You have a very peculiar habit in America of electing presidents all from the same small number of families, which is a sort of maybe subconscious way of trying to establish a sort of royal family. I don't know what it is quite. I've never really understood that.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I think, I mean, my general idea for like American history is that like America, like as an independent republic, hasn't existed for like over 100 years at this point. Like mostly, like I think the real geopolitical unit is kind of like the Anglosphere in general, right? The entire Anglosphere is kind of one political unit after World War II. And so a lot of our culture has been kind of adopting more and more stuff from Britain as over this time period as well. You could think of like the British invasion and the Beatles and things like that pretty trivially, but at the same time we have like you know, like we become obsessed with this Hollywood celebrity, and there's tons of revisions of the role of aristocracies or monarchies, I guess.
Yes, and I would also say that the geopolitical influence of Britain, given its titchy size as an island in the middle of the sea, is linked to what we've been talking about, to the Freemasonry, which of course helped to it ties in with the fact of the language and everything. But I've often thought, when we hear of John Dee, apparently was the first person to coin the phrase British Empire, and I wouldn't call him the obvious empire builder, but I think he was certainly very interested in building networks with Germans, with French, and there's a lot of thought that he might have even been trying to build networks with Americans very, very, very early on, but we're not so sure if that's true.
I think it's almost certainly true. Like I'm like a big fan of the Puritans, which is pretty controversial in America, considering that's like a slur these days. But the Puritans were all very much interested in alchemy and these sorts of things. Like they were obsessed with the zodiac. They all learned Hebrew, right? And this is the sort of stuff that they were extremely involved in. I mean, alchemy was one of the earliest courses you could take at Harvard. It was a required course when they founded it. So, and like, you know, the way these people write, I mean, it's just so much of this is like lost context, or, you know, again, like in the 20th century, you get all these revisions of Puritans representing them basically as McCarthyites in an odd sense.
I was going to, I know you're meant to, well, no, we're not. We're having a conversation. So you don't mind if I ask you questions as you ask me, because another area of interest really is what is actually going on in the world today. And I'm not asking you to give a great account of everything, but there seems to be a great shifting and moving and opening up. A lot of people are much more in touch with the sort of spiritual side than they ever were before. And I sort of get a sense that the discoveries about Shakespeare and De Vere, they all feel to me as they're tied into something even bigger, that there is some sort of great truth is opening up in the middle of what seems to be a very, very turbulent and uncertain times. Do you have any personal belief in sort of higher systems, in the sense of connection to the stars, to the universe, to bigger things than just causation of people's actions down here on Earth?
Yeah, I mean, I would definitely call myself a Christian. I mean, most my major touchstones, right, are like people like Shakespeare and stuff like this. And this is the sort of tradition that I want to kind of keep alive. People like William Blake, right? If we talk about the quaternary hidden within the Trinity, this is a major theme of William Blake's work as well. He has many quaternities, or even Jung talks about the quaternity hidden within the Trinity and things like this. But I think it has to do totally with media environmental change. I mean, I don't know if you're a big fan of Marshall McLuhan, but Marshall McLuhan and Northrop Frye are like major influences on my thought anyway. And Marshall McLuhan, when he was talking about the coming of the digital age, right? He pretty much foresaw all of these sorts of informational technologies changing in the ways that they have, just because he was pretty privy to the cutting edge of like cybernetics and plans for the future. I mean, he was talking at Bilderberg and things like this, but he said that one of the things that the digital would bring back would be a kind of return to medieval scholasticism and a what he called perfect memory retrieval. So I think that this stuff is all sort of tied, like in the same way that the printing press, if we look at the Elizabethan age, creates this like explosion and this kind of openness at the same time as there's all these squabbles and things on the continent. I think we're living through a very similar time where now everyone has access to like the universal archive and also to like publishing technology. For instance, we're talking right now, that would have been much more difficult to arrange, or we would have been possibly writing letters or something if this was 50 years ago even. But all of these things together, I think, it's just like a perfect time for a renaissance or a reformation of some sorts, a reformation of knowledge. And I think that these sorts of strains that we're pulling, like the De Vere Oxford, like you pull this thread, and a whole new history of the world that feels more linked up in some ways, or more similar to our own time, kind of starts to unfurl.
Yes, that's very interesting. Can we touch a little bit on Jesus? Because I may have this wrong, but from where I'm understanding this, people like Edward de Vere and John Dee would have called themselves absolutely Christians, with no doubt about it whatsoever. But I think they had a different view of Jesus from either the Catholic Church or the Anglican Church, and that really they saw Jesus as a man, Son of Man, as he is indeed called, and that he obviously had a very special connection to God, but not the sort of connection to God that you would have preached at you in the Catholic Church. And this, again, I think is why they had to be a little bit secretive, because of this belief that if you read the Gospels and you read them very carefully with a slightly different message in view, that what Jesus is really telling you is that man is divine and that he is part of that as a man. He is the Son of Man. Remember when he's asked, do you say you're the Son of God, or do you say you're God? He said, I think it's to Pilate. He says, well, it is you who says that I am. He rather dodges the question. And so I think I could be wrong about this, but the more I look at it, the more it seems to be correct, is that Francis Bacon, John Dee, William Shakespeare, Edward de Vere, they actually had a slightly furtive and slightly different view of Jesus and Jesus's place as the guarder of this great secret that they are passing one to another as well.
Yeah. I agree with you 100%. Some people would call this like Gnostic, etc. I always try to push back on that because people have this list of heresies, and it doesn't really apply to what is being talked about here. I like one of my favorite lines of William Blake in the Everlasting Gospel. He says, "We both read the Gospels day and night. Where you read black, I read white." So it's sort of like looking at the again, like the hermeneutics here is totally determinative. So like if we're to accept that Jesus was like a real person, like a real historical figure in time, and that his transfiguration or his theodicy is more his like revealing to us the identity of man with the Godhead, that like, man is God, that like we create like the gods, that this is the true like miracle of the Christian worldview. This itself has a very, very long tradition in all over the place. Like it's a tradition that I've been trying to track for a long time. And I could connect this like all over the place, man. I could create like a whole network listing like how this sort of idea was transmitted through time. But
yeah, no, you're right. It goes right back and to the early formation of the Christian Church, and there was an actual repugnance for the worshipping of the flesh.
Yeah, I mean, it was like it's what's like idolatry, I think, is the key thing here. Like the conception of what counts as idolatry. And this goes on like, to more modern forms where, you have Bacon writing about mental idolatries, or, and he's mostly talking about like a lot of like Catholic hermeneutics he would just consider to be like forms of idolatry. I mean, this is the pretty standard like Protestant look at Catholic hermeneutics. And this goes further, to like Marx's theory of ideology is just another theory of idolatry. So the question is like what like William Blake says that to worship the Jesus as Jehovah, to create this sort of simple identity between the two is like a form of devil worship. Even is a form of like turning Jesus into the devil as opposed to God, which is a very interesting take that I'm very anti-Catholic in my perspective. Yeah. I was raised Catholic, but if anything, my deeper engagement with this sort of stuff is what put me more off of Catholicism. Was like when I actually started to read the Bible for myself and to read all of these other things was really when when I started to like understand the text more and more. It was more stuff I was shedding from my Catholic understanding of it.
Yes, well, I too was raised Catholic, and I am in total sympathy with what you're saying there, and but I think can I just bringing back to Shakespeare as well, and this idea of religion. People often don't realise this. They say, well, the thing about Shakespeare is you read his plays and you can see that he's pretty easygoing about things, and he doesn't really discuss religion very much at all, and they're unaware of the fact that actually it was illegal to put anything about religion into plays at the time. So that's why we get that sense. But you also get the sense, I think, particularly towards the end of the sonnets, that of a deeply, deeply spiritual mind there, that is very often overlooked when we're seeing people ranting and expressing their human emotions on the stage. But of course, if you look at The Tempest again, I would say that's a very spiritual play in many ways, and ties us into this whole it is almost an underworld, but what's so interesting about it is that, and this is look at the history of the Freemasons, that actually they're often very, very grand people. They're kings. I mean, King James, who succeeded Elizabeth, he was a Freemason, and lots of the Stuarts were. Charles I, Charles II were all Freemasons, and even to this day, you'll find, I think it's the Duke of Kent, is it, who's running them. So it's a very strange thing. It's on the one hand a furtive underworld that's holding this secret that they won't express openly, and on the other hand they seem to be the top people in society, which of course leads to the abuses of the system and to the current fear and hatred of Freemasonry among people on the internet.
Yeah, I mean it's interesting to track how that history goes as well, and I know much more about the history of like Freemasonry in America than I do even in England. I mean, my English or British Isles history, Scotland, Ireland included as well, is getting better all the time. But I'm an American, so I'm handicapped with our having learned a totally fictitious history my entire life, and having to put it all together in my free time. But because like we American history is almost a complete fabrication, because we don't have this understanding that ties us to the longer history of the British Empire. Like, if you ask the average American, like what about the English Civil War, they won't even know that there were multiple ones, but they wouldn't even be able to place what year it was.
Yes, well, that's understandable. Have you come across a book called The Royal Arch of Enoch by Robert Sullivan, The Impact of Masonic Ritual, Philosophy and Symbolism? I only mention it because I've just been reading it, and I thought it was very interesting, and it is very much about the history of America and the Freemasonry that underpins many of the institutions and establishments, and takes the story right back to Hermes and everything. I would recommend it.
Yeah, I'll have to check that one out. I mean, it is a very long story. I mean, it all, like, lots of the stuff in the 20th century, like conspiracy theories about Masons, is also like a lot of it is true. A lot of the stuff, connections that they make. I mean, for instance, like FDR was like a very high level Freemason, and that's sort of like when you look at the back of the American dollar and you see the Eye of Providence. I mean, that was never on an American dollar until that time period, because the New Deal was what was really, when people talk about the New World Order, Novus Ordo Seclorum on the back of the dollar. This is really FDR was using the Great Seal of the Americas and which, again, not a very popular thing, wasn't really used for a long time. There's a huge, there's waves of Masonry and anti-Masonry through American history. And this was an upsurging part of it. And it was kind of like this Masonry was also one of the means by which we were reincorporating with the British Empire, like geopolitically, was through our various elites were, in these same institutions, like the Ivy League grads or whatever, go study in London, things like this.
Tell me, are Rockefeller, Gates, are these people Freemasons to your knowledge?
I don't think Rockefeller was not. Rockefeller was a Baptist. I'm sure he was. I don't know if he was a Freemason. I'm sure one of the Rockefellers at some point was. I mean, a lot of their symbolism. If you look at Rockefeller Center, is not really directly Masonic, but they do derive some of the same symbols. I mean, they have like the statue of Prometheus. They have like God the Geometer, like holding the compass and things like this. And I mean, like, they were very much involved in the creation of like the Anglo intelligence state, I suppose, when they were bringing over SIS people to found the OSS out of a Rockefeller Center building.
Yeah.
But I don't know if they were particularly Masonic. And again, like, what does Masonic mean at this time? I feel like it's also much different than it was earlier, because really the watershed moment, I think, is just like the theosophical movement, like Theosophy, which was like this sort of revival of these themes, was also a great transformation of these themes into something that isn't necessarily the same as their origins.
Yes. Bill Gates, do you have anything to say about him? And
well, Bill Gates, his father's more interesting, but he's, again, just connected. His father's just connected directly to like the Rockefeller lineage, and that's really where his whole career comes from. I don't believe he's a Mason, but he could be, for all I know. I don't think it's like particularly important these days. The Masonry is kind of, especially in America, is like on the decline, and the real secret societies aren't secret societies anymore. It's just being like on the Council of Foreign Relations and going to the Bilderberg Group, the World Economic Council, these sorts of things.
Yeah. So in your view, these things that you've just mentioned aren't divine or religiously driven. They're simply power meetings about power.
I would say so. I mean, I think that's how it's kind of come to be. I mean, I do think that there is a part of Masonry, or like a fragment of the Masonic worldview, in the general, just like liberal worldview. This idea of like building, the Great World Project, or like the United Nations is this sort of this final state, a sort of millenarian state. There is like an aspect of that. I don't think that it's exactly according to the desires or wishes of the early Masonic. I think it is like, this sort of happens all the time, though. I would say this happened to the Christian church as well. I wouldn't say that this is what Jesus intends for Christianity to be, but this is what happens to like institutions in time, right? Like eventually they just become reified, and the institution itself becomes the more important factor than the fruits that it's supposed to bear.
Yes. Well, through the work I've been putting online, I've attracted the attention of quite a lot of Masons who have contacted me, and so I've got a much better understanding of some of these things. A lot of them are rather disappointed. They say things like, well, I joined the Masons in order to look at the sort of things that you're putting up online when you're talking about Shakespeare, but I find I just sit around having a cup of coffee or a glass of beer with some quite dull people. One of them made a huge effort to get changed to a different lodge so that he could, a more intellectual lodge that would be studying some of these older things. And one feels that the Masonic movement now is so large, such a huge sort of umbrella of different people with different passions and different ideas, that as a group it's really lost its way, and certainly looking at the extraordinary focus that seems to be going on in the time of Bacon, Shakespeare, and Dee and this lot, that's all got lost somewhere. And I'd like to think, in my imagination, there are some Freemasonic branches, if you like, that are still thinking along these lines and trying to move the world in this direction, because I still see it as an honourable way forward for man on earth to be dedicating himself to learning and to understanding, in the belief that he will get closer and closer to the divine.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, but you know, I like the original Rosicrucians, right? For this reason, because they didn't really believe, I think, that you could actually create this sort of organization in like a real sense, but that it was like the invisible college, or you know, like or like this is sort of the more mystical sense of Christianity, where like the church is like the meeting of anywhere where there is like fraternity, like the sort of more abstracted conception of Masons. Like we're being truly Masons here, probably more so than any of the the modern Freemasons sitting around planning cookouts and things like this, because we're engaged with the real work. This is the real work.
Yes, I agree with that. It is a largely intellectual and spiritual exercise, and the bringing together of the intellect and the spiritual side. That's what seems to me to be the attractive end of all of this. And, you know, I'm sure you, like me, have looked at a lot of these books of Rosicrucianism and pictures and things, and sometimes one just gets utterly lost in the level of symbolism and stuff. And I worry about that. It gets a bit dangerous. I think if you move too far into it, you can very easily be accused of, you know, all those typical things like finding what you want to find in it, you know, making. So in the work I've done with Shakespeare, I've been pretty restrictive. I've tried not just to heap one thing upon another and daze everybody with symbols and things, and try to narrow it down to the key symbols and the key ideas that I feel that these people were talking about. And by doing that, you can certainly unlock the Shakespeare mystery with confidence, that you can't just be accused of cherry picking and all this stuff, because you'll see over and over and over again the same key is being used to unlock all the different doors pertaining to the same subject.
I mean, that's why I always recommend yours. I mean, there's a lot of people out there working on this sort of stuff, and they do get a lot of good stuff done. I'm thinking specifically of like Hank Whittemore, I think does a lot of good stuff. But at the same time, there is this sort of desire to, I don't know, spice it up or like sex it up a little. And you can get even lost in these, where you get to like what is it, like the Prince Tudor theories and things like this, where it gets a little more hazy, and there's like, you know, the lots of stuff like that. Makes it a little bit more difficult.
Yes, I'm not an advocate of Prince Tudor. I think I'm utterly driven about Shakespearean authorship, and that is such a colossal thing to get in people's minds, that Shakespeare was not William Shaxter of Stratford. He was Edward de Vere, the 17th Earl of Oxford. Now you start muddling all that up by saying, oh, and by the way, the Earl of Oxford was the bastard son of Queen Elizabeth II and was the natural father of Henry Roseley. And not only that, but you'll find some people within the Oxfordian movement have started saying, actually it started with the Baconians, but they start saying things like, oh, did you know that Edward de Vere wrote The Faerie Queen, which is ascribed to Spenser, that he wrote something called The Art of English Poesy, that he was the actual translator of Golding's Ovid, and on and on and on it goes. And, you know, the Baconians started all of this. The Baconians started saying that Bacon was the illegitimate son of Queen Elizabeth, and they started saying that he wrote all of Robert Greene and Thomas Nash and everything. I just try and keep that away, because there's such an important thing going on here, is to establish that connection between Edward de Vere and Shakespeare. And I think I've done that now, but I don't want to start muddying all the waters with too many sub-theories. I tell you what I would love is if any of your listeners who are familiar with the work that I've done and interested in other aspects of the Elizabethan or early Jacobean story were to find out how the keys that I use to unlock the Shakespeare mystery, to see if they can find it being used elsewhere, the same keys, the same symbolism to unlock other mysteries, because that I think would be really, really exciting. And it's not for me to do it because I'm, as I say, I'm driven and obsessed by this one thing, but I'd love it if other people could pick up those tools and start unlocking other doors with them.
Well, I was about to suggest something to you because this is a connection that I found extremely fruitful, at least recently, is the same sort of tradition of like this hermetic understanding, or like the 4 in the 3, and this sort of idea gets carried on in Germany as well. It gets carried on by people like Behmen, and it leads directly to Hegelian philosophy. Actually, if you look at Hegel's depictions of his own system, you will find the same triangle, the 3 triangles with the 4th triangle in the center, in his Science of Logic. So I think that this sort of tradition, or this sort of hermeneutic rather, it is all over the place. And I think that really the most miraculous thing about Shakespeare's work, and the reason why he's so influential, and I think Hegel describes why perfectly well in his writings on aesthetics, is he says that Shakespeare creates characters who are themselves creators. They create their own selves. They are poets. Like, all of his characters are creators. They have that element of the divine within them, which isn't really the case if you look at depictions of people, especially on the stage prior to this. A lot of them are like more representative, or they are like representing a certain faculty of but they don't seem to have the aspect of individual being.
Yes, I think that's a very good point you make, and I think actually that points to the very problem of the Stratfordian resistance. It's because Shakespeare is so brilliant, and because his characters are so alive, and that Shakespeare of Stratford is so empty. He's literally an empty vessel. We know nothing about him. So if you really love your Shakespeare plays, what do? But you fill up this empty vessel with all bits of these characters from the plays until you've imagined for yourself this most perfect person from Stratford-upon-Avon who wrote all these things. So when someone like me comes along and says, oh, well, actually, I'm terribly sorry, you've got that wrong. He was actually Edward de Vere. It's a completely different person. He's Edward de Vere, Earl of Oxford. They take that as a personal insult because they've created Shakespeare in their own imaginations as they believe he is or want him to be from their readings of those characters in those plays. And so when I tell them they've got it wrong, then they feel it's a big punch in the belly and a slap in the face to them. That's partly why they get so furious about it. That question that we talked about earlier, what does it matter who wrote the plays of Shakespeare, so long as we've got the plays? Now, the number of people I've had in front of me asking that question, and on every single occasion I can see that their shoulders are tense and their hands are a little bit sweaty and clenched as they say, what does it matter? So I can see very, very easily that they mind very, very much indeed. I'll tell you something interesting. If you go to Google and type in quotation marks, what does it matter who wrote? all the returns come about the Bible and Shakespeare, those two. And clearly the people who even ask that question mind very, very much indeed who wrote those two things. So it's a sort of lie to say, what does it matter? And quite apart from anything else, I find it a very rude question. If someone's got some expertise in a subject and they've got enthusiasm for it and they know a lot about it, it's just simply rude to say, what does it matter? It's a sort of madness. If you were sitting next to someone at dinner and they happen to be an expert on anything, you wouldn't turn around and say, what does it matter?
Well, I can think of some types of people who would do such things, but they weren't good dinner guests.
Yeah, no, very bad manners.
Yes, very bad manners. We look down upon people with bad manners because we're the best people, the snobs, of course.
Well, it's unnecessary not to be well mannered is the truth. It's unnecessary, and as I say, rudeness, anger, things like that, they always come into play when people are fundamentally unsure of the ground that they're standing on. If you know you're right about something, what's the need to be angry and rude? If you don't think you're right, and again, we're back to this thing of this sense of being personally attacked. I think people need to understand that opinions are hypostatic. They float above us, and we can push out an opinion, and the next minute we can have a totally different opinion. It doesn't mean we're weak. In fact, I would say it means we're strong if we can change our opinions. And that if we have an opinion that is not liked or considered appalling by someone who hears it, we don't need to think that it's a personal attack on us when they're attacking the opinion that we floated up like a bubble above us.
This is the problem with idolatry. You know what I'm saying? Like, as you were saying, like the creation of this sort of homunculus Shakespeare, that it's this sort of alchemical process, even that people invest themselves more deeply in than they're probably willing to admit when they create these Shakespeare figure for themselves. They're pouring a lot of themselves into that, and that in that sense, their understanding of this becomes alienated from themselves. It sort of fits into all this sort of hermeneutical thing I've been pushing here, right? Because they're in that way not recognizing themselves as a creator in this way. They believe that they're like worshiping their creation, this Shakespeare figure, which they've put together and invested a part of themselves in. So if you try to like take that away, it's like, you're smashing their idols, though. And that's considered an act of violence to people who are worshiping their idols, right? Whereas the Christian sense would be like, we're liberating you from being slaves to idols.
Absolutely. I think that's very well put. And this idea that they've invested themselves into someone like Shakespeare. But this happens a lot. My father used to say, when I was young, he said, you must understand that one's enthusiasms are a solitary affair. And he said it in response to I absolutely love music, and I read music at university, and as a boy I just had lots and lots of records, and I used to try and get all my friends and my family to say, you've got to listen to this, and pick up the needle and put it down on the record in exactly the groove where I knew a wonderful piece of music was about to come up. And of course, I was trying to thrust things at them that were out of context, and B, I mean, what were they learning from this other than this guy is very enthusiastic about this piece of noise? And I think one needs a bit of self-effacement when it comes to one's enthusiasms, and that therefore it isn't about telling people that we're right and they're wrong and getting angry when they don't agree with this. And in terms of the whole Shakespeare thing, I've really given up trying to convert. I wouldn't consider myself someone who's trying to convert other people to my view of who Shakespeare is. The way I look at it is I'm laying down all the things that I've found and putting them out there so that they're there for future generations to find them. In other words, it's a big act of research, and I've spent how many years, decades, looking at this stuff, and I want other people to get off quicker off the starting blocks because my stuff will be there already for them to find, and they can move on from that. So it isn't really anymore, for me, about persuading other people that I'm right. It's simply about laying out the facts for other people to find.
Yeah, I think that's a good way of looking at it too. I mean, I'm sort of like an exile myself from academia, and kind of a self-imposed one. But I think that is the real future. I don't really know if we could say reform English faculties to understand this. I think they'll probably be the last people to adopt any of this. So I think that the real worthy thing to do is one, to have a lot more fun doing what you're doing. I mean, this is so much more fun than listening to Stephen Greenblatt lecture on Shakespeare. And number two, we're building the foundations for what will be more fruitful research in the future.
Yeah, so I love the way you talk about fun, because very often when I'm looking at these things, I'm thinking of the great fun that people like Ben Jonson and people were having as they made these little puzzles to communicate one to the other. And one feels sorry for the Stratfordianists who essentially didn't get the joke. They weren't part of what Ben Jonson would have called the worthy. They're outside of it, and they're part of what Jonson, in fact, called the sluggish, gaping auditor. That's a very, very early definition of a Stratfordian by Ben Jonson. And I do feel sorry for them. We've already touched on the fact that the Shakespeare plays themselves are so much more enriched and more enjoyable if you know who Shakespeare was. But all the literature about Shakespeare, the talking about him, the passing of these secrets. I mean, just imagine how much fun it would have been to have been the designer of the dedication to the sonnets, which you can then put into a grid and get this incredible message out about it, about exactly the point where Edward de Vere is buried and what the sonnet's about. And it's all just hidden in these three triangles. And I mean, how much fun was that? We enjoyed playing Scrabble, but it would be great if we had minds alive today who actually got fun in composing those sorts of puzzles. Now, if we're moving into an age of huge censorship and, I mean, I think there are some quite bad writing on the wall of the direction we're going. Everything that goes on online seems to be spied upon and kept and data filed by the big tech companies. We may be back to an age where we have to learn to write to each other on pen and paper in such a way that the spies can't see what we're saying, and we can preserve truths. And to me, that would be the upside of it. If we really are going tits up, then let's get back to those wonderful days.
Yeah, exactly. Let's get on their level. That's what I'm saying all the time.
Yes.
I mean, I would say that we're already in that position, man. I think that what I'm doing, what you're doing, we're already doing that. It's already here. It's already happened. And what I'm mostly interested in is following this sort of line of history and this creation of, like, I mean, obviously cryptography is and poetry are almost like concentric traditions. Like, poetry is itself like a form of cryptography, you could say, or like, of condensing information into a package that has to be decrypted, right, in order for the reader to receive the true text of the message.
Yes, and I'm particularly, if you look at some of the later Elizabethan and Jacobean poems, that there seems to be, it's a matter of pride for the people writing those verses, that each line says more than one thing. Sometimes it says two, sometimes it's actually telling you three or four things. And that was the great, great art. Just as in music, you don't just want a tune, a monody. You would like to also have a counter tune, that we've got two tunes going on, or maybe three tunes going on. Listen to Dvorak or something, where the interweaving of tunes becomes the sign of the mastery of the art. And so very, very much, just from poetry, we can see this desire at that time to be saying one thing, and then at a certain level you can see it saying something else, sometimes completely the opposite to what the open line says, and then sometimes a third thing. And this is all done through use of puns, acrostics, cross-references, allusions. There's so many ways in which the poet of those days could speak double, treble, quadruple talk to one another. And these were very, very exciting times. We've lost that urge to do that, but I got a feeling it's going to come back.
I'm hoping it is. I'm trying to bring it back myself. I mean, this is the sort of stuff, the tradition of literature that I always found the most compelling. I mean, I still am a big Thomas Pynchon fan. Have you read much Thomas Pynchon?
Not very much, but I've read some, and I know exactly, and I think they're good. But what I really want to do is join your club.
Oh, I mean, I want to have you on all the time, man. I hope we become very good.
I don't need to be on. I can be a passive audience person, but I like very much what you're doing, and I think it's exciting, and I'd love to sign up to be part of it.
Well, my heart is growing many times to hear you say that, man. I'm very happy to hear that. So I would love to have you on to read some more of this stuff. This is the sort of tradition we're following, man. Like the other sort of tie, I think, with the De Vere stuff is if you're looking at just like the history of intelligence organizations or intelligence gathering, that whole time period is extremely influential for, the creation of the Jesuits and, following the Templars and these various other intelligence interests. I mean, the courts all had their own intelligence apparatuses. You can think like, just in these terms, the history of intelligence gathering is very interesting to me, especially because I believe, I don't know if, I'm pretty sure you're probably aware of this, but there's the letter or that in the Elizabethan court, everyone had their own like code numbers. For instance, John Dee's being 007, which is why James Bond is named that. But I believe there's a letter to a certain 40, just the number 40, which seems to be directed directly to Edward de Vere.
Yeah, well, yes. This is a letter from King James when he was still King of Scotland, so Elizabeth was still on the throne in England. And he's corresponding to people in the English court allotting them numbers. And most of those numbers we seem to know who's who, but there's this mysterious 40. Well, we now know that Edward de Vere connects to 1740, and as I explained earlier, 40 is Oxford in gematria, the same value of 76. And so there are quite a lot of reasons to suppose that this, and I think it only amounts to one or possibly two letters, but it's still extremely interesting what we can gather from it if that is Edward de Vere. And on the subject, by the way, of espionage, which I think is very, very close, probably closer than you realize, to the whole literary world as well. It is very...
Oh, it's extreme. I'm very aware of how close it is.
Yes, exactly. So you get not only Edward de Vere himself was involved in espionage, but so were poets like Samuel Daniel, the playwright, Anthony Mundy, a lot of them, and they're all quite close to Edward de Vere. So one almost gets the sense that Edward de Vere is running a scriptorium of writers and playwrights and scholars. Marlowe obviously is one of these people who's known to have been a spy, Thomas Watson, and that these scholars on the one hand seem to be around Edward de Vere's table putting together these plays for the court under what's known as a secret policy of plays, but they also seem to be involved in foreign espionage, and that also, of course, ties in very, very much into cryptography, because obviously it was very important to be able to send letters to and fro, and if they got intercepted, they wouldn't be understood. And then out of this came this great art of writing a message that is babyishly simple, absolutely straightforward, and yet it can contain a totally different meaning when decrypted. And this is what we see absolutely in the sonnets dedications. Absolutely. That to me is the most extraordinary encryption that I've ever come across. I'll be stunned if I ever come across one that is as extraordinary as that, where just these 144 letters set in 3 triangles, and you just unfold it when you put it into a grid, and the whole thing just spills out these huge messages, and all done in a very orderly way according to this key of 3 times 3. And it even has a picture of the ground plan of Westminster Abbey with the Westminster written inside it, an upside down cross which says Christe Eleison and South Cross Isle inside it, and then the big letter I which stands for Jesus, and it says Edward de Vere lies here. It just all laid out, and each time triangulated. There seemed to be the key to all of these great encryptions was this triangulation. They had this saying, tria sunt omnia, threes are all, or omne trinum perfectum est, everything in threes is perfect. And once you get that, you're in a whole different level of decrypting than we had with the Baconians. And the reason for that is you can't turn around and say, oh, you just found that there because you wanted to find. That's just there by accident. It isn't by accident, and you can prove it because on every little step of the way, the evidence is triangulated. So it comes at you from 3 corners. So if you take, for instance, that little thing in Polymantia that I talked about, where we have the margent note, Sweet Shakespeare, set beside Court Dear Verse, Our de Vere, which the rest of the letters form a secret, underneath the word Oxford. So there's your triangulation. Oxford, Our de Vere, Sweet Shakespeare. Now, when I first found this, the first person I sent it to was Professor Stanley Wells, king of the Stratfordianists. I said, what do you think of this? It says, Our de Vere, a secret, right by Sweet Shakespeare. He said, oh, no, that's rubbish. You're just playing Scrabble. I said, well, yeah, but I mean, the Elizabethans...
Playing Scrabble's a big deal.
Yeah, the Elizabethans would have absolutely loved Scrabble if they had known that game. Anyway, I said, look, you've had 400 years to work out why Sweet Shakespeare is written on that line next to Court Dear Verse. I'm giving you my interpretation of it because it's Our de Vere, a secret, right under Oxford. So what's your interpretation? Why is Sweet Shakespeare written there on the top? Of course, he stumbles and he starts saying, oh, well, I can't exactly say, but it's very likely that there's a compositor error, that the compositor put the side note, Sweet Shakespeare, in the wrong place. So I said, okay, fine. You've got the text in front of you. You show me where the Sweet Shakespeare side note is meant to go. Well, of course, he couldn't do that. So you see how... By using this triangulation, you can't get out of it. It's made, and these things are made so that you cannot, when you find them and you resolve them, you cannot argue them. You can't say that's just a fluke, because you get yourself in a total mess. And that's been one of the most exciting aspects of the decryption work I've done, is the impossibility for people to knock them down. And I'm sure there are Stratfordianists out there who'd love to knock them down, but they simply don't know where to start. Whereas they had a very good shot at knocking down the Baconians' encryptions. In fact, there's a whole book called The Shakespeare Ciphers Examined, I think it's called, written in the 50s by two very famous American decryptors who decrypted the Japanese messages during the war. And they pull those apart one by one and set out rules about how to trust an encryption, to know it's right and it's not just the guesswork of someone who's finding what they want to find. And the work I've done fits absolutely perfectly within their rules. It obeys every rule they ask for, and how, in spades. And they weren't on.
Yeah, absolutely. The best thing about yours is that you use the Cardin's grill, which is the like how you can make an immediate like material historical transmission of this idea of transcription in this particular manner, encryption in this particular manner, is from Cardano, and this ties so perfectly well to that whole milieu in like Oxford, that like they were all reading Cardano.
Yes, well, so the Cardano's grill is actually where you punch a lot of holes in a piece of paper and then lay it over a text, and certain letters will show through and you'll get a message. So it's very similar indeed to the equal letter spacing grid. So in that you simply take, say, a poem that's written vertically down with in iambic pentameters or whatever, and you lay it out in columns, and then you see messages. Now a lot of anti-Stratfordian or post-Stratfordian scholars have tried to put these things into grills before, and they've haven't done very well, because they've always been looking for straight lines. They want a message like Shakespeare is Bacon in one straight line. But what I discovered is it's much, much more interesting than that, because they're not putting it in straight lines. They're putting it in relevant shapes under relevant numbered columns. So, for instance, in the upside down cross, which we all know is the Petrine cross, the cross of St. Peter, that appears in column 7, we get the message, Christe eleison, Christ have mercy. And number 7, of course, is related entirely to the forgiveness of sins in the Bible by Jesus, but also St. Peter was the patron saint of forgiven sins. Do you see what I mean when I'm talking about triangulation?
Yeah.
You've got the column number, you've got the message, you've got the shape in which the message is written, and they're all confirming the same thing, all pointing in one way. So you cannot stand there and say, that's just chance.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's tied, like, this sort of, like, the ability to deny or reject something like that is considered a form of, like, sophistication to a degree, oddly. I think it's just, again, because of, like, the hermeneutical training. For some reason, like, a lot of, like, more simple folk or less well-read people will see something like that and be like, oh, yeah, that makes sense. Because it does make sense if you believe that people intend to create meaning, when they make things. But this sort of idea is that, like, things just kind of emerge and spontaneously in human generation, like individuals, like that when they produce art, they kind of are just like it's like a wind blowing through them, and it just appears in front of them, formed as it is, and it's alien even to themselves, and they're just interpreters of this sort of wind that blows through them. So even their own interpretations could be unintentional somehow. I think that I see this like all over the place, though. There's a very big anxiety about the idea of intentionality in creation.
Yes. Well, in the work I've done, there's a view that you can solve this out mathematically, and there was a mathematician who got onto one of the grids I'd done to try and ascertain the odds of it being there by total chance, and it was as close to 0 as you can be. I can't remember the exact figure. It was 1.76 times 10 to the minus 13 or something, so it's 0.00013 times. I mean, but almost this is meaningless, because when we're in the world of these encryptions, they're so brilliant that they play to the common sense of the individual that straight away you can see when you see how it's been set up that it's true and that it's right. Now, that's not a very scientific thing for me to say, and I know there are some people out there who'd say, well, no, I really want to have the mathematician's figure on this. I want to hear that it's 1.76 times 10 to the power of minus 13 chances of that being there by anything other than chance. But actually, you've seen these grids, and I think some of your listeners have seen them too, and you just know, you know they're right, as I say, because of the way they're set up. They are built like an absolute tungsten fortress, so that you can't, specifically so that you can't knock them down. That's the whole point of them. You know, they're trying to preserve a truth. That's what they're doing. And so it's obviously extremely important that if anyone should stumble on this truth, and this, by the way, is another whole interesting area of discussion. I mean, were these things put there to be found? I'm not sure they were. I think they were put there on a purely high-minded view that the truth must be preserved. Well, maybe if someone finds it in 100 years, 1,000 years, 10,000 years, they don't care, they don't mind, but the truth has been preserved. I don't think it was like a treasure hunt, saying to people like me, well, look at this, see if you can find the gold at the end of the tunnel. I don't know, but my feeling is it was a total high-minded desire to preserve truth rather than to set up a game. There's a little thread here, pull on it, see what you find. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of agree, but the way I would look at it is there's the great line in the Bible, which is it's the glory of God to hide a thing and the glory of man to find it, right, to discover it. And I think so the glory in the God of like the God within man would be to create such things, like with the sort of ideal reader in mind, like one that who will pick up on all of these things. I think that is like where the greatest art is made, is when someone's making art for the ideal reader who would get all of these or pick up on all of these little encryptions and things like this. I don't think maybe they weren't intending necessarily for us this long ago to start picking up on this and as some form of future treasure hunt or a time capsule of some sort. But I think that in just encrypting their works with the idea of God even, or history or time as being the ideal reader of these things, and that all the things hidden would be disclosed or would still exist and testify to their truth in eternity in just being encrypted in those places. I think that belief is a sort of predeterminative of our ability to get rid of, to pull these threads and find these things.
Yeah, I'm fascinated by that quote you give. Did you say the glory of God to hide a thing and the glory of man to find it? Do you know where that comes from? I'm ignorant of it.
Let me find it.
And that's very interesting. You think it's in the Bible, is it?
Proverbs 25:2.
Oh, that was quick.
It is the glory of God to conceal a matter, and the glory of kings to search it out.
Fantastic. Yeah, I didn't realize that. That's very, very good.
But that's one of De Vere's favorite books of the Bible too. If you looked at his marked up chapters in his Geneva Bible, so
fantastic. Thank you for that help. I need it.
For sure.
No, I mean I'm getting amazing help from people who comment under the line on those videos, and there are a lot of people with very, very bright minds out there, and they're looking at some of the things I've shown them, and they're bringing other stuff into it, and I really feel there's a big team building up here of like-minded people who are really getting zestful about this mystery.
We're building the invisible college, you and I, and all of our compatriots. This is I really believe this though. I'm not even joking. It's kind of, but there's the fun in the not taking it all too seriously at the same time. This is sort of what I want to preserve. This is fun. This is it's a better use of time than yelling at the news or watching Marvel movies or something. You could be doing philology and history.
It's massive fun, and I get this sense of maturing and getting wiser about the whole world as I delve into this. That it just started off to say, well, surely some contemporaries were telling us that Shakespeare was Edward de Vere, and in that time, I can't tell you the numbers of things that I've come across and read, and meeting and talking to you, and all these things. It's the most exciting time of my life, and it's all come through unlocking these mysteries and thinking about them and thinking of their relevance today.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the ways I got into all of this was just reading a lot, and this is the sort of thing I think this is what reading deeply produces, is this sort of voluntary society even of readers.
Yes, and we'll bring back the snobbery, though we might not call it that. But I get very much the sense that people who understand some of these things that are going on are exactly what Ben Jonson and people called the worthy. And again, that sort of helps in what I was talking about earlier, is not needing to convert people to understand this, but just needing to be with like minds who get it and who are enjoying it. It doesn't hugely matter to me whether someone down the street is furious and thinks that William Shakespeare of Stratford wrote it. I don't mind. I don't have any drive to go and put him all right on that. It's got so much more exciting now because we're talking to people who are on the same wavelength, who really understand it and are enriched by it, and their lives are all the better for it. I mean, I would love more people to join, but it's not the mission to go converting stubborn people who want to put their fingers in their ears and don't want to understand it.
Yeah, it's kind of I just feel more pity for them, or I feel like it's unfortunate because they're missing out on so much. And it's like it's less of an attempt to convert, and it's more like an invitation to the festivities.
Exactly right. Yes.
What are you doing over there? Like, you're having no fun at all. I can tell. Like, you guys are retracing the same tired lines over and over. Isn't it rather boring? I guess I don't know. They don't seem to be bored of it.
One area that you're quite expert in, I notice, is the alchemy, and it's something I haven't studied in a great deal of depth. And the reason for that is it doesn't seem to impinge very directly upon the Shakespearean authorship. We know that Edward de Vere did do alchemical experiments, but I don't see that the answers to the authorship problem lie in alchemy. But it's always on the fringes of all my reading, and I think it's something that I need to branch out into and get some more understanding of it. You obviously love it. Yeah. You spoke very eloquently about it.
It's massive. It's massive. The undertaking of understanding alchemy is very huge. It's a lifelong work, I think. I'm still working on it myself. I appreciate that you're saying I seem like I know a lot about these things, but I'm constantly learning new things about it all the time. And I mean, I'm not as proficient in Latin as you are, so I'm sure like if you really get into it, you would outpace me quite swiftly.
Do you think there's any benefit to understanding the alchemical mind?
I think that we already inhabit it to a large extent. Like, I think that it's like what's most useful about it is being able to create this sort of bridge between the like Middle Ages or like old cosmology of like the Ptolemaic universe and whatnot to our modern perspective. I mean, alchemy was that bridge. Like, that alchemy is like the transformation of that world into the world we have now. So to follow that story, I think, is really interesting because I don't know. I think there's just this general sense that there's this like kind of stark divide somewhere in modernity, like early modernity. You could even possibly place the Elizabethan period, where things are just like after that they're modern and they're things that like we can kind of understand. Before that, it's kind of like cryptic, and we have to like try to explain them through more modern terms, like, you know, doing like a sociological class analysis of medieval society or something like that, because like their frame of reference and their state of mind is so alien, I think, to people today. But the alchemists in that time are the ones closest to us.
Really, yes, interesting. Well, as I say, I must look more into it. Anyone who hasn't looked into it and hears the word alchemy, they think quite wrongly that it just means fraudulent people trying to turn base metal into gold. And obviously it's a much, much deeper subject than that, and something that I certainly want. Are you able to recommend a kind of good, as it were, beginners or a good guide to the Renaissance alchemists? I've read a lot of Frances Yates. She's quite good on this.
I was just about to say Frances Yates has probably the best stuff. It's like a lot of it is just kind of in specialized little like articles, or like I spend a lot of time just like going on JSTOR and reading like articles and little like academic publishing things. It's kind of like a very niche interest, I suppose, amongst like medievalists and things like this. So since Yeats, there hasn't really been that great of a like totalizing study. But I would recommend like Giordano Bruno. I think in general is like one of the most important figures to like read, and obviously De Vere and Bruno, I believe, had some interactions in their own time, and I even think that he might be depicted in Love's Labor Lost.
Fascinating. No, but I have read Yeats's book on Bruno, but to be very honest with you, I've rather skipped the pages about the alchemy because, again, I felt it wasn't helping me very much on the Shakespeare and authorship question. But I'll go back to that.
I think you'll feel differently about it if you read, especially the Elizabethan Renaissance by Yeats. I think you'll find very interesting.
Great, I will certainly do that. I think she's a very good, clear writer on matters that are quite complex. It's always nice to have someone who writes well when they're talking about complex things, because the last thing you want is a sort of academical, jargonized language when already one's having to wrestle with the difficulties.
Yeah, there's so much on alchemy. It's tough. I mean, one of the things I've been getting interested in recently is the potentiality that a lot of this alchemical symbolism really came from China and then came along the Silk Road over a long period of time. That's been my interest recently. Even some aspects of the Kabbalah are kind of rooted in like Taoist alchemy, which is pretty fascinating. I'm like really trying to close my more recent interests have been like China specifically.
I really envy the broadness of your mind, and at some point, I think in the not too far future, I will have to put down the tools and of the war on Shakespeare and broaden out and learn a lot more things. I mean, it'd be fascinating to learn about China, but you see what it's like when one gets very obsessive on one subject, and people say this is great book on China, and
I try to be like a generalist. Like my goal is to have a really wide frame of reference and try to like connect things together that haven't been connected together yet. And I'll leave the more the more specialist stuff to people following me later.
Well, you are the archetype of a Renaissance man, and of course that's what all these people were. And I wondered if you went to Shakespeare, to Edward de Vere, and said, "What do you do?" I don't think in a million years he would say, "I'm a playwright." He was all these people, even the scientists, they knew how to write poetry, and that was one way of expressing, and that I suppose knowledge was more limited in those days, and there were some who thought they could genuinely read every single book ever written and know all knowledge. But everyone in those days, John Dee, all of them, their expertise was so broad, and they were so interested in everything about the world. Back to what we were saying, that this knowledge of oneness with God comes through learning and knowledge, that there wasn't any knowledge of the world that was out of bounds. We now live in a world where expertise is very much hailed and honoured and thought to be a great thing, and a few very wise people are mistrusting a lot of experts for the simple reason that their narrowness of their minds and of their fields, they haven't actually connected the area of their expertise with the broader world and with other aspects of the universe. And only when one starts connecting everything one's got, because everything is about a connection. All of being is connection, and the more expert we get, the more foolish I think we become.
I mean, I think that the fool who continues in his folly becomes wise, and the foolish thing to do is to not specialize, right? The smart and wise thing to do today is to pick a very specific specialty in a pretty niche subject, especially in academia, and to make that your little hobby horse for as long as it takes for you to get tenure. And then I don't know what it's like after that, but I don't really feel like the generalists exist, or there's not really much of a holism or an attempt to systematize all of these sorts of realms of knowledge. I think I think people are yearning for it, though. I think there's a real desire for a kind of more holistic, larger perspective than we're provided. And I think that like the lack of that sort of perspective actually leads to a lot of like conflict and violence, right? Like the sort of idolatry of the specializations and the experts in their particular niche fields or whatever, making pronouncements on X, Y, and Z. People can sense there's something off with this, and it creates real problems. It's not like a trivial thing at all.
It does. I have to say that in my view, the Americans are better than the English at this. I went to give some talks at Ohio State University and was so impressed that they said, well, what do you want to talk about? I said, well, I can talk about Shakespeare. I can talk about Evelyn Waugh. I've just written a book about God. I'll talk to you about God. I'm going to talk to you about Ludwig Wittgenstein. So I've written a book about that. And they said, absolutely fine. And they sent me to this, what was called a Department of Interdisciplinary Studies, I think it was. And they said, right, on Thursday you're in the Divinity Department, on Friday you're in the Philosophy Department, and then you're giving a speech in the Music Department. And you don't get that in English universities, this idea of interdisciplinary studies. And I went to Oxford University to try to persuade them, with a man who I thought had millions of pounds but didn't turn out to work, but to set up an interdisciplinary studies there, which would allow the people of Oxford, not necessarily the people affiliated with the university, but anyone in the university and outside of it, to come and hear lectures and discussions. And the rule of the game would be that you don't just have one person from the English department talking about what he knows, or one person from the physics department. The idea is you get three people, always keep it in threes, who discuss the connections between their different areas of expertise in completely different fields. I would love that to happen. One day, that's my dream, would be to set up something like that in English universities. But we, as I say, are a long way behind you already. You do have these interdisciplinary studies, and that in itself shows some awareness of the connection of things being crucial to the understanding of the world and to the understanding of God.
Yeah, we do have some remnants of that the liberal arts tradition, right? I mean, it is kind of funny how much this is like we've gotten into this fracture, like this sectarian splitting of the humanities, which I think is almost like I think that like what happens in universities is sort of representative of what's going on in societies as a whole. Because I mean, you know, where else do we produce people, or like produce the people who represent society, but in these universities? And I think this sort of the bringing together the humanities again to a full body of humanity, I think, is a major goal.
And getting these subjects that are held in the sweaty grip of these experts, to get them to loosen their grip, just as you were talking about Edward de Vere in that lovely poem about the labouring man. It's about giving what you know to the world in a form that they can understand it and they can connect it to the things that they know. That's what we're not getting. And this is one of the great problems of modern academia. More and more and more, they're talking to each other in a highfalutin, incomprehensible language. And it's of no use to anyone. Their essays and articles are kept in periodicals that are very often behind paywalls. Their academic books are disgustingly expensive, so that the normal person can't buy them. And as I say, they're talking in a vernacular that is incomprehensible to most highly intelligent lay people. That's got to stop. And again, we compare that to what was going on in the Renaissance. The first thing, they were all speaking a common language. They were all speaking Latin. So they went from England and France and Germany, they went to the Padua University, and they all listened to these lectures in Latin and then contributed for their great knowledge of other things. There was so much more inclusive scholarship back then. It sickens me thinking how the Ing-Lit Brigade clasp onto Shakespeare as though it's their personal property and nobody's allowed to talk about it.
Yeah, as if Shakespeare isn't everyone's property at this point. Shakespeare is everyone's. Everyone. They're doing Chinese performances of Shakespeare. Kurosawa does great adaptations of Shakespeare. There's Shakespeare in Iran. There's Shakespeare everywhere. He's not the domain of the English language departments in modern academia.
He's the most popular playwright worldwide by the largest margin of anything. Nobody comes close to him in the number of performances worldwide. No one begins to get close.
Well, I think if we're thinking in terms of like our time being somewhat like the Elizabethan period, there is this sense in which like there's they're like Catholic churches. A lot of these universities where they hold on to knowledge. They don't share it. It's all locked up into these archives and things, and they go voraciously after anyone who's leaking this to the people. For instance, Aaron Swartz, he was responsible for getting a lot of JSTOR documents. Like he downloaded a huge percentage of their archive and put them up for free on the internet, and he was sent to jail for life for this. And there's great people working in Eastern Europe specifically, just because of their copyright laws, who create tools for anyone across the world to have access to academic journals and things like this through like proxies and whatnot. And this is very much hounded after. They're like enemy number one to a lot of the copyright brigade. It's a weird thing for me growing up as I have. I'm only 27, but I grew up in a time of like rife with like internet piracy and things like this, and like I've always been used to being able to get what I want for free usually, if I know how to look for it and I know how to find it. And that's sort of what I've realized is like the real academic vocation, is that act of searching and finding, like looking in the archives for things and liberating them for the people, or like representing them and in a way that is useful to people. That's what I'm interested in doing. So in a certain sense, I think that the real solution would be to like dissolve a lot of these organizations and to put their properties into the commons. Like this is how John Dee got his great library, right? Was when they started taking all of the goods and selling off the stuff from all these monasteries.
That's right, and he went to Queen Mary and said we've got to collect it up and not let it dissipate all over the place. But I agree, sharing of knowledge is absolutely essential, and the locking up of knowledge is shocking and actually criminal. And as you probably know, a lot of the academic things, not only are they behind paywalls, etc., but they're all about cross citations to people in their own departments or in their own fields. And we find universities getting bigger grants based on the number of citations that they have. So this is another issue, that you will never, ever, ever get a Stratfordian scholar quoting or citing anything from an Oxfordian journal, however learned it is, because it doesn't count, because it's not connected to a university. It doesn't count as part of the great money-raising exercise of number counting of citations. And it means that they're just, all these bores are just talking to each other and boring each other to death and cutting everybody else out. So I think the academic world is in a very sad place at the moment, particularly in the Anglosphere. Well, I say particularly, to be absolutely honest with you, I know nothing about, for instance, Russian universities and such, but the English and American and Australian universities are in a useless place, and increasingly they're going to find themselves sidelined, because with the advance of the internet, intelligent, scholarly people who want to research are doing it online and coming up with all the really great ideas, and not overweighing them with pointless citations and cross-references and having to explain in a very laboured and boring way why you've got a different view from somebody else. They're just getting on with it. And going back to this Shakespeare thing, the acceleration in knowledge of the Oxfordian theory and of Shakespeare over the last 5, 6, 7 years, I mean, it just puts everything that the Stratfordian scholars, so-called scholars, have been doing completely out of the pitch, out of touch. It's nothing. And on the very, very small things where the Stratfordians have come up with something that they think is new or interesting, it 100% of the time plays straight into the hands of the Oxfordians as a massive boon and benefit to them, and of really no use to the Stratfordians at all. Fascinating, that.
Yeah, well, they're not even so much interested these days in English departments with Shakespeare in his own context or anything. They're mostly interested in what we can do, or how we can sort of mutilate his works to make points in the present, in a way. Like that's the whole ideas of adaptation and of and use.
Yes,
a sort of utilitarian use. And I would connect this sort of utilitarianism even to the way that these departments function. Like, as you said, like they want to have these sort of quantifiable metrics ever since finance has become the main reason why universities exist. They want to know what departments are doing well and which ones they should cut. And when it comes to the humanities, they can't really come up with a quantifiable metric to determine whether or not they're functioning as they should. So the best they can get is the amount of publishing and the amount of citations people are getting. And so obviously, like the system, it curates itself to create as many of those citations as possible. And that's a different end than creating like wisdom.
There was a report in the English papers a few weeks ago, and I'm not sure whether it was fake news or misinformation or what, but stated that the Oxford University Music Department was no longer prepared to teach Beethoven and Mozart because they were white men thriving in a time of slavery and such like. And we've already heard some talk of American universities trying to get Shakespeare out of the English departments on the basis that he was a privileged white man who said things that might have been racist or feminist or whatever it is. And so you can see that if we're already starting from that point of view, it really doesn't help to say, well, actually, he's an English earl from the very privileged classes. That it becomes even more anathema.
That's true. All of a sudden, he's no longer the layman everyman, right? Now, when it matters, now he's a privileged. Now he's one of the aristocracy. When it comes to not reading him, right, for reasons to not read him. Yeah. Oh man. Well, I don't know. The problems with that are like so deeply ingrained. I don't think that the institutions are salvageable at this point. I think that the best thing we can do is create these sort of like parallel institutions, whether they're podcasts or whatever. As you were saying, like to get those three types of people into a room from different fields to like have a discussion about the similarities. I mean, that would be a great podcast, right? Like that's something that people would listen to voluntarily.
Well, that's right, and I think you're in a good position to do that actually with your podcast. That's the sort of direction that would be really useful, because you can, particularly when we're talking about what we're talking about now, because the area we're talking in is a great area for experts from different sides to come in and discuss it.
Yeah, absolutely. And the more people I get involved, like you, I know you know people, and you might know, and those people might know people, and that's how it goes. And this is how I am forging my intelligence network.
Yeah, well, look, keep up the great work. I think it's very impressive what you're doing, and I think it's got a great future in it. And yes, you are going to be among the great educators of the future, because your whole attitude is the correct one. It may be the antithesis of the academies, but the academies, as you say, and I think you're absolutely right, they are crumbling by their own mistakes. So either they've got to rectify or die.
Yeah. Well, I think this is a good spot we could leave it off on. I definitely am going to be calling you in the future, though, because I love your perspective, especially if you start doing some more. I think you're great on Elizabethan the time period and stuff. But like I have like we could get really deep onto the specifics of that whole time period, because I think that like getting down to the level of like dates and years, like timelines of events, people who's going where, doing what, getting to like that level of fine focus on this whole milieu and this time period, I think would reveal a lot of interesting connections.
I agree. So thank you very much for having me on. It's been a great pleasure and a great joy, and I hope I haven't left you too much of a tangle to put in some order.